AOC. People love Jasmine Crockett. People love Eric Swalwell and the like. And I think that the Democratic Party should.
The political landscape is often a battleground of optics, sound bites, and carefully curated personas, and few figures embody this dynamic as vividly as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, commonly known as AOC. She has been a polarizing figure since bursting onto the national stage, hailed by some as a progressive beacon and derided by others as a symbol of performative politics. Recently, her public image has faced intense scrutiny, particularly after a high-profile critique from comedian and political commentator Bill Maher, who challenged her rhetoric and policy positions on live television. This moment, described by some as a brutal takedown, has sparked a broader conversation about AOC's authenticity, competence, and the Democratic Party's direction. Supporters argue she represents the voice of a new generation, while critics contend her style prioritizes theatrics over substance. This essay explores the complexities of AOC's political persona, the criticisms leveled against her, and the broader implications for the Democratic Party, drawing from recent public discourse and media reactions. AOC's rise to prominence was meteoric. Elected to Congress in 2018 at the age of 29, she defeated a long-serving Democratic incumbent in a stunning primary upset. Her campaign, rooted in grassroots energy and bold progressive ideals, resonated with younger voters and those disillusioned with establishment politics. Her platform, Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and wealth taxes, positioned her as a champion of systemic change. Her ability to leverage social media, particularly Twitter and Instagram, amplified her voice, making her a cultural phenomenon as much as a political one. Supporters like Don Lemon, a former CNN host, argue that AOC, alongside figures like Jasmine Crockett and Eric Swalwell, embodies the kind of energy and authenticity the Democratic Party needs to energize its base. They contend that she connects with voters who feel ignored by traditional politicians, meeting the moment with passion and urgency. Yet, this very passion has become a lightning rod for criticism. Detractors, including Maher and podcast host Joe Rogan, argue that AOC's rhetoric often lacks depth, relying on buzzwords and emotional appeals rather than coherent policy arguments. A widely discussed moment came during an interview when AOC was pressed on her stance regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. Initially, she spoke with confidence, declaring her support for a two-state solution. But when asked to elaborate on what she meant by the occupation of Palestine, her response faltered. She admitted to not being an expert on geopolitics, a concession that critics seized upon as evidence of her unpreparedness. The clip went viral, with commentators likening her to a student who hadn't done the assigned reading. For her detractors, this moment encapsulated a broader issue: AOC's tendency to lean on progressive slogans without the substantive knowledge to back them up. This critique gained traction after Maher's public dismantling of AOC's rhetoric. On his show, he challenged her authenticity, questioning the narrative of her working-class roots. AOC often frames herself as a product of struggle, a former bartender from the Bronx who understands the plight of everyday Americans. Maher, however, pointed out that her upbringing was not as disadvantaged as she portrays. Her father was a small business owner, and she grew up in a relatively comfortable environment with access to quality education. While she did work as a bartender after college, critics argue that her story of hardship is exaggerated to align with her progressive brand. Maher's critique struck a nerve, suggesting that AOC's persona is more about optics than reality, a charge that resonates with those who see her as a media creation rather than a principled leader. The backlash didn't stop there. Joe Rogan echoed Maher's sentiments, comparing AOC to Vice President Kamala Harris, whom he called another media creation with more slogans than substance. Rogan's critique highlighted what many see as AOC's Achilles' heel, her reliance on emotional theatrics over policy rigor. For example, during a congressional hearing, AOC passionately argued against a bill aimed at ensuring fairness in women's sports by excluding biological males. She framed the legislation as an attack on trans girls, accusing Republicans of enabling gender and genital examinations of young girls. Critics were quick to point out that no such inspections were proposed. The debate centered on maintaining competitive fairness, not invasive examinations. Her rhetoric, while fiery, was seen as misleading and inflammatory, designed to grab headlines rather than engage with the issue's nuances. This pattern, bold statements followed by questionable logic, has fueled accusations that AOC prioritizes performance over substance. Another incident that drew ire was AOC's defense of Representative Jamal Bowman, who pulled a fire alarm in the Capitol, allegedly to delay a vote. When questioned about the incident, AOC's response was muddled, filled with vague phrases like active and fully participating and saying there was a misunderstanding. Critics, including Maher, mocked her for what they called word salad, a term often used to describe her tendency to string together buzzwords without clarity. This moment, like others, reinforced the perception that AOC struggles when pressed beyond her prepared talking points. Her supporters, however, argue that such critiques are unfair, pointing out that she's often held to a higher standard than her peers. They see her as a young politician still finding her footing, evolving in real time under intense scrutiny. The debate over AOC's authenticity extends to her broader political brand. Critics point to her attendance at high-profile events like the Met Gala, where she wore a designer gown emblazoned with the phrase "tax the rich" as evidence of hypocrisy. How, they ask, can she rail against income inequality while mingling with elites at exclusive fundraisers? Her defenders counter that such appearances are strategic, allowing her to bring progressive messages to spaces typically dominated by the wealthy. Yet the optics of these moments often overshadow her intentions, reinforcing the narrative that her activism is performative. Maher, in particular, has called out this dissonance, arguing that AOC's actions undermine her claims of fighting for the working class. The broader conversation around AOC reflects deeper tensions within the Democratic Party. Figures like Don Lemon argue that the party should embrace leaders like AOC, who resonate with younger, progressive voters. They point to her ability to galvanize support and dominate social media as evidence of her political prowess. In a discussion with Maher, Lemon insisted that people love AOC, comparing her authenticity to that of Donald Trump. This comparison, however, backfired. Maher swiftly countered that AOC's appeal is limited to certain circles, noting that even Lemon's own social group didn't universally support her. The exchange highlighted a growing divide within the party. Should Democrats double down on progressive firebrands like AOC, or should they pivot toward more moderate, broadly appealing leaders? This question becomes more pressing as speculation swirls about AOC as a potential future leader, even a presidential candidate. Her supporters see her as the face of a new Democratic Party, one that's bold, unapologetic, and in tune with the concerns of younger voters. Her critics, however, argue that her lack of depth and polarizing rhetoric make her a risky choice. Maher, for instance, suggested that elevating AOC could lead the party down a dangerous path, alienating moderates and independents. He pointed to her policy missteps, like her opposition to Amazon's planned headquarters in New York, which critics say cost the city thousands of jobs. While AOC framed her stance as a defense of local communities against corporate greed, detractors argue it was a short-sighted move that prioritized ideology over economic opportunity. The Amazon controversy is just one example of how AOC's positions often spark fierce debate. Her calls for investigations into the Supreme Court, including potential impeachment of justices, have also drawn criticism. During a discussion on the topic, she argued that the court lacks adequate oversight, a claim that critics like Maher dismissed as constitutionally dubious. They argue that her rhetoric undermines the separation of powers, painting her as someone who prioritizes ideological battles over institutional stability. Her supporters, however, see this as a bold stand against a court they view as increasingly partisan. This tug-of-war between principle and pragmatism, idealism and realism, defines much of AOC's public image. The panic surrounding AOC, as described by her critics, stems from the growing perception that her star power is waning. Once seen as untouchable, she now faces mounting skepticism from both the left and the right. Progressives who once hailed her as a visionary are beginning to question her effectiveness, while conservatives seize on every misstep to paint her as a symbol of liberal excess. Even within her own party, there's unease about her influence. Some Democrats worry that her far-left positions on issues like defunding the police or abolishing ICE could alienate swing voters, jeoparding losses in critical elections. Others, however, argue that her willingness to push boundaries forces the party to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic inequality and corporate power. Don Lemon's defense of AOC, despite its contradictions, reflects the broader struggle within the Democratic Party to define its future. His claim that the party should put the people out there who the people want raises a fundamental question: what happens when public demand clashes with political reality? AOC's supporters argue that her popularity among young voters and activists makes her a necessary force, even if her ideas are polarizing. Critics, however, warn that popularity alone isn't enough. Leadership, they argue, requires substance, not just style, a critique that cuts to the heart of AOC's political brand.